So I have here my Winchester Model 74. I've had this rifle a few years. Kind of a neat old rifle, but it had the most horrible trigger that I think I've ever experienced on any firearm. The trigger pull was excessively heavy, and not only was it heavy, there was so much slack in the trigger that the trigger didn't break until it was at the extreme rear of the travel, and it almost seemed like I had to sometimes put 20 pounds of force on it before the sear would finally break. So for that reason, I never shot it very much. Just kind of had it around. I used it for pig butchering one year, but the trigger was so horrible that trying to get any sort of precision was just wasn't very pleasant to shoot. So I got to looking at it, and I found the way to greatly improve the trigger pull on these Winchester Model 74s. So I'm sure that there's some more out there, and maybe you experience the same sort of problems with your trigger pull. So I'll show you real quick what I did. So I'm going to start by disassembling the rifle. I'm going to pull the magazine tube out of the buttstock. Verify it is indeed unloaded. And I'm just going to simply remove this screw. This is the takedown screw, action screw. Once that's loose, barreled action comes right out of the stock. And these Winchester 74s are unique in that they're butt tube fed, and the trigger is stamped steel. The trigger actually straddles the magazine tube. There you can see the trigger moving. And if you look closely, there's a shiny spot right here. Shiny spot right there. That is what actually contacts, and again, I'm not sure what Winchester actually calls some of these parts, but I'm going to call this the sear bar, or maybe more properly, this is the disconnector. But that trigger pushes on this. When you pull the trigger, it pushes up on this bar. There, you heard that click? This is a striker fired action. When you push up on that bar, the striker drops. So, started looking a little deeper exactly how this trigger mechanism works, and I realized that this bar pushes up on a component in the bolt assembly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove that. So you, on this side of the action, push this button. Once you do that, you can withdraw the bolt assembly right out of the rear of the receiver. Really, really neat feature. This rifle was made in 1941. This particular example is 1941. I think these are made from the 30s up into the early 50s. But super easy to remove the bolt, unlike a lot of the modern semi-autos, like a Ruger 1022 or a Marlin, where you can't really clean them from the breech. At any rate, here is what I did to improve the trigger pull. This right here is the sear. This is the sear. It captures the striker when this blows back, the blowback semi-auto action. This blows back, and this striker is captured by this sear. So, under the tail of this sear, there's a spring. There's a spring nested in there. I'll show you here. Now, I already swapped this spring out. So, pretty easy to do. Just get a small pin punch. Once that pin is removed, this sear just lifts right out of the top. Well, there we go. So this is the sear. This is the spring. Now this spring that I put in there is not the original spring. This is the original spring. I put a chunk of toothpick in it just so I could keep it separate in case I needed to reinstall it. But that's not going to be the case because the spring that I put in there is working really well. This is the spring I replaced it with. It's a fair bit lighter. Now, I wish I could tell you exactly what spring to buy to put in this, but I can't. I bought a small spring assortment from Wolf Gun Springs some years ago. That's kind of what you see in here, some of the contents of that. So this is a spring from Wolf Gun Springs, but it just came in a large assortment of gun springs. So I just kind of went through the different springs, found one that worked. With that being said, initially I tried a spring that was too light, and during test firing, I would end up with essentially a dead striker. So I would fire around, the rifle's action would cycle. I went to pull the trigger again, and I had a dead trigger. The striker wasn't retained by the sear. So there was nothing dangerous about that, but I had some malfunctions. So I actually had to put a little heavier spring in. Once you replace that spring, the sear can drop back in. This is the surface of the sear that actually grabs the striker. I'm just going to drop this back in. And once that's in place, it's a pretty simple matter just to drop the pin back in. And there we go. There we have it. So with this lighter spring in the back of this assembly, my trigger pull went from being absolutely unusable to just under 3 pounds. Have just under a 3-pound pull now. These are a little finicky, unless I don't know the secret. There we go. Sometimes getting this assembly started back in. There we go. I'm going to push the button on the far side, and that slides right into the back of the receiver. Pretty nifty how that works. So, like I was saying, just swapping that spring made a nice 3-pound trigger pull. In fact, the last time I tested it was just under. This trigger is not as consistent as a lot of triggers. I've noticed that it varies a little bit more than a standard trigger, probably just because of the moving parts that's involved here. Again, we have the trigger pushing up on this. I am going to show you one other thing. So I'm very happy with the trigger pull weight. However, I also decided to address the distance the trigger needs to be pulled. I wanted to get rid of some of that pre-travel. So what I did, right here I have, this was the shank of a drill bit. And if you look at it, you can see I have it mirror polished. I chucked this drill bit backwards into a drill. I polished it with progressively finer sandpaper, and I ended up with flits on a buffing wheel, and I have that mirror polished. Then I cut a notch in it, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to epoxy this right on top of the trigger bar, just like so. I tested this just with it sitting in there, and that eliminates almost all the trigger pre-travel. So I would end up with a nice light trigger, as well as getting rid of, so that the trigger breaks more at the beginning of the trigger pull instead of the trigger fully at the rear. So I think I'm really going to be happy with that. But I'll just show here real quick. I'm going to reassemble this. Okay. Now, I generally don't make a practice of dry firing rim fires, especially older ones like this. But my understanding is that user manual for the Winchester 74, the first step of disassembly was to dry fire the rifle. And then obviously when you're shooting, this doesn't have last round hold open, so occasionally you'll dry fire inadvertently when your gun's empty as well. So, but I'll just demonstrate the trigger pull now. So see what it comes up at. Okay. So we're at a pound, pound and a half, 2 pounds, 2.5. All right, there's 3. Okay, so that time it broke just a hair over 3 pounds. So yeah, essentially got a 3-pound trigger pull. Once I put this this button I fabricated, once I put that on top of the trigger bar, I should have a really nice short travel trigger as well. So hope you enjoyed this video. I hope maybe it helps some of you guys out there with the 74. If you have experienced the same trouble I had with the awful trigger pull on these rifles, they can be improved quite a bit. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.